I'd like to show you another masterpiece from AlphaZero. So far we've looked at some beautiful attacking games, but this is a strategic masterpiece. Before we look at the game, remember, if you're not subscribed to the channel, then do click down on the button there to subscribe. It's free to subscribe, and if you want to support the channel, then there are buttons for PayPal and Patreon down there somewhere. And if you want to check out the playlist of all the AlphaZero games, then you'll find that in the description or in the tab up there as well. Right, on with this game. This really is something very special. So AlphaZero with white, Stockfish with black, and this was played just over a year ago in January 2018. And this is no set starting position, so the two machines are on their own, but they're playing something that is very familiar to human eyes, a Queen's Indian. So nice and solid. Interesting that AlphaZero prefers d4 openings and plays with a very solid fianchetto, making sure that its king is absolutely safe. So standard move, black exchanges or wants to exchange minor pieces to give himself a little bit more freedom. Now it's possible to take on d2, bishop f6, f5, they're all reasonable moves, but d5 from Stockfish, planting a pawn in the middle of the board, so we have a very typical queen's pawn structure. And queen b3. So just applying a bit of pressure on d5. All pretty normal so far. This position has been reached before. In previous games, black has exchanged here or here, but we have c5 from Stockfish attacking the center. And everything pretty standard to this point. And here is where Stockfish plays a highly committal move, very ambitious move actually. Perhaps a normal move here would be bishop f6, but it plays this move, c4. In this kind of structure, it's very difficult to know when to push this pawn forward. The advantage of playing like this is that black now has a 3-2 overlap on the queen side. So, you know, if this b pawn can be launched forward, then this can be very nice for black. The disadvantage is that it gives white more security in the center because pressure has been taken from d4. And, well, that will enable white to perhaps advance in the center of the board. Stockfish now plays knight b4. It's possible to take on c3 and put the knight back on c7, bring it to e6. That's pretty solid. But, well, let's see the idea behind knight b4. Well, obviously attacking the queen. Queen d7, bit of development. And now we see a move which for AlphaZero is absolutely typical. With the central structure fixed, it loves to play around the side of the board and typically likes to attack the opponent's king. So it starts to do that with h4. Now you can get away with moves like h4 because it doesn't actually harm white's king position. Very important that this pawn is nicely planted on f2. So plenty of pieces around the king, so you can get away with advancing the h-pawn. And let's see how far it goes to cramp black's king. Rook c8. Knight gets pushed away. Now, there is a downside to playing like this, that this knight can sometimes hop into b3. Queen b1. So this increases the queen's mobility. Some very beautiful maneuvers here actually. So Stockfish starts to build a little pressure here. No problem, we'll cover that one. And now knight a5, so this typical maneuver. And now knight g5, threatening checkmate in one move. So there are various ways of dealing with this mate threat, but all of them have a slight disadvantage. So for example, if we play g6, well, that weakens the squares around here, and then e4. So I think this shows the disadvantage of pushing on with c4. In this case, there's no chance of this queenside majority being exploited, but white is able to blast through the middle and potentially attack black's king. I can see a few daring humans taking off this knight. Now, of course, you don't really want to give up your bishop for the knight. But here it's quite a tricky position because black can open up these files, the F file, and sometimes there might be the possibility of a sacrifice, an exchange sacrifice here. And, you know, you can try and get the queenside majority rolling now. Objectively with that bishop, yes, I prefer white, but this is quite tricky. But Stockfish clearly wasn't too happy with that and played f5 instead to block this diagonal. Well, that's all very well. It clamps the e4 square as well, so preventing white playing e4 and of course preventing the mate. But there is a huge drawback to playing f5, and it weakens the e5 square. So the knight hops around, and yeah, job done with knight g5. It's going to at least perhaps land on the e5 square. And it's possible to do that. But, well, there's a few other things going on in this position too. Rook a2, so that's preempting knight b3 and protecting that pawn, which, as we'll see, is useful. H6 from Stockfish, not absolutely necessary. There were alternatives. The knight could have gone to b3, for example, and then pushed the queenside majority. a4, very useful move. Just claiming a square here. This queen b5 could be useful later on. And just claiming a bit of space. We'll see that could be very useful later on. At the moment, black can really only wait in this position. And now strategy starts. King h2. This is a very fine maneuver. Let's see what happens. So Stockfish is just waiting. Rook h1. So this is unusual. And we can see that the rook is usefully employed protecting the e-pawn. h5. So the idea of playing this was so that this pawn can be protected. If the queen comes back, then the pawn can be protected with king g1. And because there are no minor pieces around the king, in fact, doesn't really matter. There is no danger to the king. And in fact, you know, black is just waiting here. So this pawn has come to h5, just claiming a square here, and we'll see how AlphaZero exploits that with the knight coming back. Now this pawn is threatened, but now the bishop takes charge of defending that and defends the e-pawn as well. Stockfish is only waiting. Right, how come this knight moved from f3 to here? Well, you can see that it's heading in to this very important f4 square. So it's very fine maneuvering. And now, well, before it gets there, queen b5 attacks the knight. Now there could be potential for a sacrifice here, which could really actually disrupt white's position. So therefore the rook has done its job on the H file and switches to D1, protecting that pawn. You'll notice I'm not giving many variations here. Well, there haven't really been any tactics, not so far anyway. So yeah, this is all about maneuvers. And the queen comes back. It didn't want to be shut out with knight b3. And threatens the pawn here. So the bishop comes back, and now finally the knight comes into f4. And then knight into g6. And here Stockfish exchanged bishops. If I just go back a move or two, it's certainly not necessary to exchange here. I mean, perhaps it was concerned about this bishop hopping out on a3. You can see a point to this pawn move a4 then. But after the exchange of bishops, this does leave these dart squares available for the knight and the queen. And that is a beautiful spot. Now rook b2, so it's, well, as we'll see, looking to come up here. Knight b3 is possible, of course, and then the queen would come into f4. And, well, the game would take a very different turn, but you can see I've highlighted a few things there. Let's get the paint off the board. Although white still has to break through in this position, I think there are very good chances to make a break on the king side. So white could build up, for example, playing the pawn to e3, rook to g1. The bishop would bounce around to c2. So imagine that bishop has gone to c2, and then there could well be a break with g4. Nice to expel the knight as well. Anyway, the game continuation, knight b7. So Stockfish still kind of waiting at the moment. I think wanted to play the knight to d6, but obviously that's not great in this position. So there's some hesitating from Stockfish here. Knight g6. So if the queens are exchanged, this pawn is going to drop. This is the problem. So therefore queen c6. Now queen e5. This is very brave. Well, it would be brave for a human. Of course, the machines know very well that this is completely safe. If the bishop drops back then to hit the queen, then this pawn can be taken. And in the meantime, this queen is starting to take aim at the d pawn. So here, if bishop f7, now it is possible to just push the queen away a little bit, but in fact it doesn't get very far. After bishop takes, rook takes d5, and only then recapturing here, which is obviously good for white. Yeah, Stockfish very confused, just playing this knight back and forth. Bishop g2. Now, before actually executing the next stage of the plan, there's just a little bit of piece improvement. So that rook comes to support the a pawn. And here king h7 played. Well, what happens on knight d6? Obviously a crunch moment, because if the rook drops, then, well, black has achieved something. So I'm sure we'd see an exchange sacrifice, and this would be actually rather similar to, in some ways, to the game continuation. Just let me show you what would happen. So an exchange sack, but I think a very promising one. And, well, I mentioned this maneuver earlier, playing the bishop round to c2. The knight looks wonderful on e5. There's pressure on f5. Now, even if this doesn't drop, you can imagine, let's get some paint off the board. So a bishop on this diagonal, and perhaps a rook switching to g1, and ultimately g4, just to break open this diagonal on the king side. And well, you can imagine if the queen and bishop were lined up on that diagonal, then black's king would be in massive trouble with no black bishop to cover those squares. And you can see that the rooks are pretty impotent in this position. They have no open files, so black is still just waiting here. Right, let's go back. King h7, knight comes to f4, so this pawn is basically going to drop, but it's an exchange sacrifice. Rook hits the queen, but rook takes, so white gets there in the nick of time. And if rook takes queen, then rook takes, and well, white has just won a pawn. So bishop takes. So it's a pure exchange sacrifice, similar to the scenario we looked at a little bit earlier. And pressure building. Now this doesn't actually win an exchange because although this is a fork, black has a saving move, queen b7. And queens are exchanged. So white still the exchange down. So what's white got for it? White has a bishop and a pawn against a rook, but strategically this is a wonderful position. Mind piece is tremendous, obviously the knight in particular, supported by the pawn. And it's this central pawn majority which is very important. Well, here black played knight e4, but if black were to play, let's wait a bit, let's support the f pawn. Then f4 is possible, followed by king f3, and well, ultimately g4 to break open the position. And with these beautiful central pawns, I think it's very promising for white indeed. And black's queenside pawn majority here really going nowhere with the pawn on a4 and rook on a1. It's a very important little improvement of white's position that AlphaZero made earlier, and it really has an effect in this endgame actually. It's just very difficult for black to realise this majority, and indeed could activate this rook very nicely. Pawn on h5 very important. It means that this pawn can't be supported, so this one pawn effectively knocks out these two pawns, and black's king is very poor here. Whenever white breaks through with a rook, then there are potential mate threats. So coming back to this position, that's why Stockfish played knight e4 to force the issue. It's very interesting that here AlphaZero plays in such a simple way, just exchanging off and playing f3. So it's just about realizing this central pawn majority. And even though, well, material balance is still rook against knight and pawn, but these rooks really can do nothing at all. Rooks need open files, but here they don't have it. And it's time just to advance the pawns. And at this moment, clearly AlphaZero went into full calculation mode. And this is a really beautiful idea. Remember, if rook takes pawn, then rook b3, and that's counterplay. So first of all, knight f4, and this looks very passive to put the knight back, but the pawn is securely defended. The knight actually secures the king as well. The king can just sit on e3 without any danger, and then it's just time to advance these pawns. Not to mention, this rook can also have an effect. So that pawn is protected, and now AlphaZero has just calculated that actually it can just push its pawns all the way through, and it's not concerned about this counterplay. Well, I think a human would be concerned about this because it's not so easy to calculate all the way. but in this case the machine does it perfectly, of course. So threat to make a queen, this comes back, e6, threat e7, king f8, and now final move of the game, knight d4. Just threatening to put the knight on c6, and it is absolutely game over. So for example, let's say king e7, check, knight takes, followed by a queen, or rook d8, knight c6, followed by e7, check, or rook a6. Okay, that stops knight here, but knight f5 is very strong, and after this let's make a queen, and then the rook just comes back to stop the a pawn, and with an extra piece, that's a very, very simple win for white. Well, what a wonderful strategic hole we saw here. What a grand concept, you know, going right back to this position, starting with h4, starting to gain ground, and we saw how that pawn just crippled two pawns, and that enabled white to get more control over these central squares. And this pawn move a4 very important as well. And finally, yeah, these center pawns coming good in this position. Just a wonderful achievement. Remember, if you want to see more AlphaZero games, do check out the playlist. You'll find it down there in the description, or even up there in the info tab. Have a look around, and there's plenty more to look at there as well. Thanks for watching.